Hi, thank you for having me on today. We have a big group on, over 150 people. I never thought I'd have that many people in my living room, but it's really exciting to have the conversation about grief and depression and how to differentiate and distinguish those. I think it's important to set the stage that the people that are attending today may be walking their own grief journey, or maybe you logged on because you're a clinician wanting to know more how to serve people who are walking a grief journey. Either way, when we talk about grief, I think it's important to know that we have to take care of ourselves. This conversation can be really triggering, and it can cause us to kind of have some hard emotions that may follow us after. So I want to kind of set the stage for today and what it's going to look like, and just let you know that if at any point today things get hard or triggering, I want to give you permission to log off. It's not going to hurt my feelings. After this training today, if you're feeling some big emotions or feeling a little bit of discomfort, please take care of yourself, and however that works for you. Obviously, as a Gladney staff member, I have walked with many families who are working through, infertility, miscarriage, and loss, families who are adopting, birth parents who are placing their children for adoption, and adoptees who are finding their identity. I've led birth parent support groups at the Gladney Center and have provided education. So it is a joy and a pleasure to be with you today to go over this conversation. Um, so I want to talk about why I like grief. So one of the things that we're going to talk today about a lot in detail is grief, and understanding what grief actually is, because I think that we know a lot about depression and some of the symptomology, which obviously we're going to cover today. But grief is a cultural kind of nuance that we just don't really know how to deal with. And so today we're going to talk about grief to start us off, and then we're going to go through the clinical differentiation between grief and depression and complex grief. So one of the reasons that I love grief is because I've been in the mental health field for about 10 years and worked as a forensic interviewer, interviewing children who had experienced a traumatic sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, or witnessed to a violent crime. Obviously, in the very, very early stages of their grief journey. I've worked in private practice and sat with people on their darkest days, as well in adoption. There's a lot of joy in adoption. There's also a lot of pain. And so I clinically have understood grief for about 10 years, and have walked with people, but I walked my own grief journey a little bit over 2 years ago. And as a therapist in the field, I wanted to busy myself in my grief journey. And so I was going to do everything possible to research and understand how to grieve well, because that's what I thought my job was. And as you and I both know, that wasn't productive or helpful because I wasn't a therapist, I was a griever. I remember walking through the hall of Barnes and Noble looking on the shelves for a grief book that looked like me. My grief was ambiguous loss. It wasn't grief of a person. I lost a person, but not through death. And so I really struggled to find something that looked like me and something that could tell me that I was going to be okay and I was going to survive this. And because I couldn't find a book on the bookshelf, I really leaned into understanding research and trying to understand the different types of grief and why I wasn't a book on the bookshelf. Um, One of my favorite books that we're going to reference a lot today is It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. If you are a grieving person, I think this is a wonderful book to put on your nightside table and dig into when you're ready. I think these are mascara stains, if we're being honest. So I really wanted to understand different types of grief, grieving people, and understand why I was having the experience that I was. Um, One of the reasons that I like grieving people and like grief work specifically is because in our society, we don't know how to take care of people who are deeply grieving. Whenever I talk to a griever, one of the first things that I like to say to someone who's in my office or a friend is, "This is the worst thing. I'm so sorry. This is terrible. It sucks. It shouldn't have happened. I'm with you in it." And it's a text message or a conversation that people aren't used to having. And I have heard time and time and time again from people, oh my God, thank you for affirming that. Like, I felt like I was doing everything wrong. And I, as a griever and a therapist, thought that I was doing everything wrong in my own grief journey. So I believe in grief that it is important to acknowledge today that we are not here to fix pain in grief. We are just here to tend to it. You'll see houseplants on all my slides. It's because it's my new weird quarantine hobby, but also because I think that in grief, we tend to things, and the houseplants in my grief journey have been a attending to process of gently taking care of things, watching them grow, watching them change, knowing when to water them, really learning how to tend to grief. And it's been a really big symbolic thing for me. When Jenny and I were talking about what presentation to do for Gladney University, the conversation of everyone is grieving came up. Everyone is in this global pandemic. And so if you have grief or depression in the middle of a global pandemic, it's extra hard. It's really interesting. I think a lot of grief feelings are surfacing and coming up for us just because, we're having to sit still. And that is really scary. Glennon Melton, who just wrote the book Untamed, which is a wonderful book I'm reading right now, talks about the concept of a snow globe. And so we all are a snow globe, and in the middle of our snow globe is like a thing. And so you guys can imagine right now with me, like your snow globe, it has an item in the middle that symbolizes you, your grief journey, your trauma history, whatever that is. Glennon's symbol was a dragon. And so we keep our snow globe shaken up, and the snow surrounds it and covers up that thing in the middle. And then when it sits still, we see the thing in the middle. We see the grief and the pain and the trauma and the hurt that we have. But if we keep it shaken, we keep remembering that we're busy and we can keep our eye off of it. But when we're still, we see that grief so clearly. And right now, during this global pandemic, I know a lot of people are having to sit in grief. I know that I am. Feelings are coming up for me that I've been able to busy away for a long time. But because I'm having to pause my life, feelings are coming up. And I know that maybe even some of you who logged on today are experiencing that as well. So I think it's important that we talk about kind of the cultural problems in grief to understand when we're talking about the difference between grief and depression. So I know culturally, we as a culture are pretty dismissive and pretty avoidant, meaning we don't like feelings. We don't like to talk about our feelings. We don't really quite know how to label them or understand them. And so then when we're talking about, a grief experience and we're flooded with, a multitude of emotions, it's just confusing because we haven't quite learned them. I remember when I was in therapy a few weeks after my grief experience happened, I was describing to my therapist that I, had this really difficult phone call, and it was just really traumatic for me and caused a lot of distress for me emotionally. And I was talking to her about how I was walking around the room and I was pacing and I was raising my voice and I was drinking a beer and I was just kind of what looked like on the outside, it felt like I was having a meltdown or even like this break, this mental break. And she looked at me and she said, "You were feeling emotion and you were trying to regulate your body through that emotion." And it was the first time in my life someone had looked at me and said to me directly, "You were feeling that emotion, and it's okay that you were feeling that emotion, and how you felt that emotion was the best thing for you in that moment." And so just that acknowledgement was so, so, so important. The problem with our culture with grief is that we're taught that grief is messy and it's terrible and it's an A to Z process. Like it's a linear thing that we need to accomplish, we need to walk out of, and we need to have this beautiful redemption story. And I don't know about you guys, but putting expectations on top of a griever is not a beautiful thing for them. All it does is teaches them to compartmentalize their emotions, medicate their emotions, and to quickly get out of them because they're making people feel uncomfortable. Our culture does not teach us that grief is something to tend to, or to support or to sit in. All of those feelings aren't very action-based. They're really just being. And it's not something that we're comfortable with because there's not a prescribed answer or a prescribed, this is how you do grief. So David Kessler, who is one of the leading researchers in grief, has over 40 years of experience in grief. Actually just came out with a new podcast with Brene Brown that my friend Lindsay just sent me before we got started. He is a researcher, but also lost his son when he was a grief researcher. And he talks about that there is no one model for grief. And it makes us all uncomfortable because every griever grieves differently. And so therefore, when we're, a therapist in a room or a psychologist or a doctor, and we're trying to assess this client, there's not a right or wrong way to do grief. And it makes us so uncomfortable. And it makes us project our own grief journeys onto other people. It actually sometimes even makes us compare grief. Oh, she had 1 miscarriage and she had 4, right? So we do this weird leveling thing where we're projecting our own feelings or experiences onto someone else. Grief also looks different for different people. So there's not, when I initially heard grief when I was new in the field, I thought someone died. What grief researchers tell us is there's a multitude of different types of grief, and how people experience them are all different. So I lost a relationship with my mother. She didn't die, but our relationship is a relationship that I grieved like a death. It wasn't a death grief, but it was a grief for me that would be classified by researchers as an ambiguous loss. So ambiguous loss is basically where there was no death, there was no ceremony, there was no ritual that acknowledged this grief, but life will not return for that person as normal because of this grief. This is a grief that was actually studied with several families who had lost a child to kidnapping, and they didn't know if their child was dead or alive. There's obviously death grief. So if someone passes away, obviously that is a more ceremonious, there's more routines and rituals that symbolize this grief. There's complex grief, which is basically if someone has experienced grief and they also have a history for depression or anxiety or some other mood disorder, it's kind of this coupling of grief experiences. And then obviously when we're talking about grief, I think it's important to talk about, trauma, and how those experiences, traumatic experiences, could symbolize an ambiguous loss, which would be life never returned to normal because of this grief experience. So as we talk about grief today, I want you to know that yes, we are talking about death grief, but we are also talking about grief from a multitude of perspectives and losses. And if you're like me and you're looking for a book on the bookshelf, knowing that grief, the term, can be an umbrella to any of the losses that you may have experienced in your life. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the problem of grief in our diagnostic community. So for, therapists, doctors, social workers, there's not a lot of research about grief. The interesting thing is that not many of us show up to a research study, 5 days into losing our partner. It's not something that there's a lot of capturing of data. A lot of grief data that has been researched in the field is really the back end of a grief journey. And so it's difficult to even kind of analyze and anticipate what the beginning phases look like of grief. Obviously, in a world that tells us that grief is an illness or it's diagnosable, we, tend to look at grief as you start with genuine sadness and you end up in this really great place of acceptance and you're a changed human, and there's all these weird expectations on you as a griever and what your journey is going to look like. I love that Megan Devine said that grievers don't need to be seen as a diagnosis or a problem to be solved. They don't need solutions or fluffy rainbows that you and I are comfortable giving them. So I know that, like, if you're, walking with someone who is grieving, a lot of times you want to fix it for them. You want to say the right things. You want to, make them feel better. You want to tell them that they're going to love again, that there was a purpose behind this, experience. When really what we're doing is we're trying to fix it and we're not just letting them feel it. What someone who is grieving needs from a human that loves them, from a therapist, from a doctor, is not an expectation of a linear process with a redemption story. They need someone to sit there and say, this is the worst thing. I'm staring into your abyss and I cannot believe that this happened to you. This is not okay. I'm going to sit with you in this grief and I'm going to be here for you when you want to laugh, when you want to cry, when you want to be scared, when you want to be angry. I will stare at this hole in your life with you, and I will not make it better for you, but I will sit with you in it, and through sitting with you in it, it will become better because there's a person with you in this journey. Some grievers need someone to hold their hand and look at the grief with them. Megan Devine says some things cannot be fixed, they can only be carried. So in the early days of grieving, a lot of grievers hear things like, well, you'll get pregnant again. You'll marry again. You'll love again. You're going to make a beautiful story out of this terrible thing. First, we're expecting them to do things in the middle of day 5 grief. And second, what we're saying is, I'm uncomfortable. So I love it. If I was to say it back to you, you'll get pregnant again. I'm uncomfortable trying to fix this for you, right? You'll love again. Don't be sad all the time. Like, there's hope. Like, it's going to be okay. Like, these awkward notions that we are so uncomfortable in dealing with someone's grief or sitting with someone's grief. Cheerleading never solved any problems. These are fluffy rainbow statements that are not real. We are uncomfortable and we don't know what to do with it. One of the reasons that I love working with grieving people is because they just want someone to look at them and say, this sucks. I'm so sorry. I can't fix this for you, but I want to listen to you and I want to hear about how you miss her. And I want to hear about how hard this morning was to get out of bed. Working with grieving people is not this complex problem to be solved or stages to get them through. Nora McNerney, she wrote the book Hot Young Widows Club, which is like the best grief title. She said that people will push us to our friends who are grieving because they don't want us to get our sad onto them. People are so uncomfortable with these emotions and experiences. When we do, as grievers, experience joy in our life, sometimes the people in our life are like, thank goodness, like, there's a happy ending. Here's this beautiful story. Like, thank gosh, it's wrapped up in this pretty bow. It's what they want for themselves to feel more comfortable with us as individuals. But really, it's just another chapter. This chapter wouldn't have happened for this grieving person if the chapter before didn't exist. And so it's not that we move on, we just move forward with that grief. And as professionals, we lead grief groups and we lead, counseling sessions. And the goal of all of that is what we think sometimes is to get them back to normal functioning, right? When I'm diagnosing someone, I'm looking at, is there something going on with their lives that's outside of the range of normal functioning for them? And my goal subconsciously is I want to return them back to normal functioning. My family says this all the time. It's my favorite term. There is no such thing as normal. There is new normal. There is a new normal that exists within this grief. It's not a problem to be solved. It's an experience that we carry. And so when we're working with grievers, we want to fix this with them. We want to walk them through the stages of grief that I'm about to talk about. But grief is not a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be carried. And so our job as humans that love them, professionals who want to help them, is that we learn how to sit with the hardest thing we've ever heard and the hardest emotion we've ever seen someone carry. We want to learn how to sit that, because grief work isn't fixing or having pretty answers, it's companionship. Companionship, not correction, is our way forward to helping individuals who are grieving. A grieving person, they're going to move forward, but it doesn't mean that they've moved on. It's more McNerney. So some of you guys may be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She's quite famous in the grief community for creating the 5 stages of grief, which was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and hopefully acceptance. And Kubler-Ross was a pretty blunt lady. She loved grief. She was comfortable with it. On one of the talk shows that she did in the early 70s, someone was saying that they were so uncomfortable with the topic of grief, and she said, well, then turn off the TV. She knew that grief was something to be talked about, to be publicized about, and to acknowledge the normalness in it. Things went a little bit wrong for Kubler-Ross. So her findings about the 5 stages of grief basically were, she worked with terminal cancer patients, and through her work with terminal cancer patients was able to kind of watch the chronological cycle of grief before death. I mean, an inside view into death and dying, and watching someone walk through that. And so through her work, she learned that, that there were some stages and some emotions that people experience through that. What happened to our friend Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is that someone took one sentence out of her giant book, which is called On Death and Dying, which was written in 1969. Someone took one sentence out of her giant book, and the mental health community ran with it. And we said, this is how someone grieves, and if they're outside of the limits of these 5 words, they're doing it wrong and they're depressed. If it doesn't happen in this cycle, then it's wrong. We should get them help. We should give them meds. It's not correct. Kubler-Ross thought several times about writing new books because she felt like her work and her research was taken out of context so much. Really and truly what happened is that our community wanted a prescription for grief, and we didn't know how to integrate it into the world of sitting with people. Yes, during grief, you probably experience denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and hopefully acceptance. That would be ideal. But the thing about grief is that if anyone on this webinar has experienced it, it's a roller coaster. It's back, it's forth. You might go through those 5 emotions in one day. You might sit in anger for a year. I don't know what it's like for you. And just because mine looked one way doesn't mean that yours looks another. But our mental health community is so desperate to understand grief because of our lack of research that we really clung onto it and did a disjustice to Kubler-Ross's research. And therefore, we've created check marks for people who are grieving, who now feel inadequate in their grief because they don't know how to grieve within these limits, and they feel like they're crazy or doing it wrong if they're not, in sync with one another. So Harvard Medical School psychologist Susan David wrote that the problem with grief and grief research is that we are fundamentally an avoidant culture, like I talked about earlier. She wrote the true way home to happiness is that we, let people see that, we're smiling. That's how we define, our culture defines like being well, doing well. It's that we've got this bright and shiny face on, that we have this beautiful redemption story from our terrible grief journey. So what we do is, instead of processing the grief, allowing ourselves to feel what we feel without judgment, we medicate and we put on a smile and we swallow the lump in our throat to exist and to make our people feel better and less concerned for us. It's like casseroles. People bring them for 2 weeks and then they expect you to go back to normal life and grief to look better and boxed up. You can grieve deeply for 2 weeks, we'll bring you casseroles, but then let's move along. I recently shared a story with a friend of a deep, dark emotion that I was having in relation to my grief. And her face, her emotion, and her words was immediate kind of concern and like disjointed thoughts about, my experience. All I learned from her experience was that she was not capable of holding grief for me, and we won't talk about grief together in the future. So I think really and truly it's that avoidance of, we as culture, we as people who love people just want everyone to be well. but really it causes us to button up, take some pills, and put on a fake smile. And when really our life feels like there's a gaping hole in it all the time, and we don't know how people see that. So Megan Devine actually, in her book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, proposed that, my Harry Potter fan shout out, that the reason J.K. Rowling's book, the Harry Potter series, was so popular is because it's kind of dark. And that our culture kind of clung on to that because there aren't stories of darkness and despair and family loss without a bow at the end of it. And like, yes, there's some good, parts of Harry Potter and things happen, but in the Harry Potter series, grief always exists in that world. And Divine questioned, maybe we liked that. Maybe we liked that for once someone was telling a story of despair and how to live through it, not fix it. Adrienne Rich says, there must be those among us who we can sit down with and weep and still be counted as warriors. We liked that Harry had a grief journey. We liked that he, had loss and he still was a hero and he was still able to conquer and survive some things. The thing is about grief is that pain is bravery. Feeling the feelings is brave. Getting out of bed is brave. Sharing with people that were struggling is brave. And so maybe we as a culture liked that was actually embraced. We need to teach grievers that it's okay to exist with the feelings that they carry. So society basically says to grievers that there's two models. Either you can be in a corner crying all the time and classified as a depressed person, or you can be this beautiful butterfly that sprouts from its cocoon and has this beautiful redemption story. Those are your two choices, pick one. And Megan Devine writes after her grief journey that she wondered if there was a middle way in grieving to allow an individual to stand in the middle of their destroyed universe and make a home there. To let them find a place that honors their grief and also integrates it. So we're not requiring these experiences of them, but we're just letting them feel what they need to feel in order for them to one day be able to sit in the grief and have a chapter 2. Have a moment where they're allowed to honor their grief and bring it with them through the process, not solve it here and then put it in a pretty box and tell this beautiful story. Because we don't triumph over grief, death, or loss. And if we continue to see our grief as a problem to be solved, we will never get comfort. Pauline Boss, who is one of the major researchers in ambiguous loss, shared that because we have a Western culture that is so mastery oriented, so success oriented, that we always look at loss as a problem to be solved. And so I would propose that if we're looking at grief as a problem to be solved, we're not able to look at it with the whole picture because we're not able to hear the story and understand it. Therefore, we're slapping labels of mental health diagnoses on people who are just truly grieving and we're uncomfortable with their emotions, so we want to help them. Our hope is to help serve them, but really it's a detriment to them not to just let them feel what they need to feel and support them through it, tend to it. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why we should understand the difference between grief and depression, why it's important for the people we love and the clients that we serve. Obviously, surface level grief and depression probably present pretty similar. So if you were to walk into my counseling room and you had been grieving, you would probably describe the exact symptoms for a depression diagnosis that I could give you. Doesn't mean it's depression. So grief can absolutely turn into depression. And if we're trying to understand, grief and depression, I think it's also important to acknowledge that it's purely semantics. When we're looking at an individual who is grieving, it's purely semantics. Anyone who is suffering a grief journey, it's undeniable that they are going to share similar symptoms with depression. So let's kind of walk through what grief looks like symptomology-wise and what depression looks like. And then we're going to even lump in complicated grief. So with grief, there's obviously going to be an identifiable loss. Now, when I'm talking about these symptoms of grief, I want you to know that I'm talking about it from an individual who doesn't have a history or inclination to or neurobiology to any kind of mood disorder or dysregulation in normal typical functioning. This is an individual who obviously had daily stressors like you and I, but didn't have any history, risk factors of mental health, trauma history, things like that. So this is what we would classify probably a neurotypical individual. Their neurobiology was didn't have a risk factor to a mood disorder. So with grief, we're looking at an individual had an identifiable loss. So I had a miscarriage. Let's use that as an example. Someone had a miscarriage. And that day forward, everything felt different, painful, hard. That day forward, it was hard for them to get out of bed, hard for them to eat a meal, hard for them to want to go to work. So there's a trigger point. There's my dog in the background. Sorry about that. There was a trigger point. So depression, we might not be able to find a trigger point. This could be for a few things. So this could be that maybe that there's a lot of depression history. Maybe that there is some biological history with the family, but there might not be a root. With depression, I think it's important to note that if someone has an extensive trauma history, obviously there might not be a specific date or time that we would have seen a disturbance in mood. With grief, we know that someone who is grieving may or may not be able to feel joy. If you've listened to our podcast, Reframed, you've heard me say it 100 times, but joy and pain absolutely can coexist. People can be grieving and they can feel joy. Sometimes grievers even struggle with shame over this because they feel so uncomfortable that they're feeling joy because they just lost their partner, or because, they just lost someone that they loved and now they're experiencing this joy and it feels like they're doing something wrong. Sometimes with our grievers, we see that they are comfortable with people being present in their life, and maybe they're not. So again, there's a lot of maybe ifs. Whereas with depression, they might have a history of isolation from others or not really wanting to lean into someone or talk about something. With grieving people, we see a wide range of emotions. Again, joy and pain can coexist. They can have a joyful morning and they can have a hard afternoon. That would be normal. For a lot of grievers, that feels really confusing for them, though, and they feel like they're doing something wrong. With depression, what we would see is that there's a generalized feeling of guilt, generalized feeling of just a kind of apathetic mood across the board, across the day, across the month. With grievers, there is definitely going to be some guilt. For people who were witness to an accident, people who didn't answer the phone when it rang, people who, make up even stories about their own responsibility in the grief, that's normal. For people who are struggling with depression, there's just a general, I want to say, sense of worthlessness, general self-loathing. So it's not surrounded by an incident, it's surrounded by I am bad, everything that I do is bad and wrong. This is also important when you're trying to understand someone's trauma history when you're working with depression, because the feelings of guilt may be surrounded upon the messages that an abuser may have given them. With grief, we see that the self-esteem is still positive, is still there. They can be sad and they can also know that they are not bad, that they are not bad for feeling joy. They're not holistically changed about their view of self. Whereas depression, there is a negative view of self typically. A really interesting subject that people are really uncomfortable with grief is self-harm during grief, and that's kind of where we bring in the complicated grief conversation. So for a griever, you may hear expression of, I wish I had died with them, not because they want to hurt themselves or have a plan to hurt themselves, but because maybe they were involved in the car accident and that they wish that they were, if they have a faith orientation, they wish they were with that person in the afterlife. It's not that they have a desire, belief, or plan to hurt themselves. It's just that they miss that person so much that they wish they were with them. With depression, you're going to hear self-harming thoughts as, I wish I was out of pain. Obviously, you'll hear that with grief too, but typically with depression, you're going to hear some warning signs of, I don't have the desire to cope. I just want to get out of this. Where with grief, it's typically like, I want to be with this person. So you'll hear some different things around that. Again, asterisk on everything. Everyone's journey is different. And so some of these symptoms and some of these expressions are going to look different for every person walking this. It doesn't have to meet every checkbox, just like there's not a right book on the bookshelf for grief. Now, complicated grief is when a griever has a history of a mood disorder and they may have experienced, major depressive disorder. Maybe they have experienced postpartum depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, some kind of mood disorder that already increases our risk factor for coping skills to deal with grief or neurobiology to deal with grief. And so these are people that their signs and symptoms are typically a little bit more severe, and you will hear a little bit more suicidal ideation, which is what research is showing us about complicated grief right now. So basically, it's where a griever has one mental health diagnosis or more, and then there's, gosh, the straw that broke the camel's back, another, major incident in their life that has caused this. It's, when a family has just, gone through, really a lot of loss, and there's a person with RO neurobiologically wired to have a struggle with grief, a depression, a mood disorder, or something like that. So these are people that we're just going to keep a little bit more of an eye on, and we're going to watch their symptoms a little bit more to make sure that they don't turn into a mood disorder that needs to be managed through medication and different types of treatment, maybe inpatient if something got severe. Grief it's so interesting. When I was doing some of my research for this presentation, grief is classified by many clinics, specifically the Mayo Clinic, as what we call a temporary condition. And so what we see with medical providers specifically is that if they think that grief is going on more than 6 months a year, they try to throw the label of depression on it. Understandably so, a lot of the symptoms of grief and depression can be similar, but what that does is it tells the griever that they're doing things wrong, and that they're not allowed to feel things for X number of days, years, months, weeks. We know that grief is not something that you can, return to normal from, that it is a part of, your experience, your life, your story. And so it does last and it does persevere, but we just want to watch symptoms and make sure, obviously that it's not turning into something that, they would need further help for. So grief can be defined as a natural response to any loss, including physical, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, or spiritual responses. So some of the symptomology when we're looking at diagnosing a grief experience versus a depression experience. For grief, you'll see change in appetite. You could be eating more or less, sleep disturbance, fatigue, exhaustion, tearfulness, difficulty concentrating. One of my favorite words is called brain fog, and grievers sometimes can sound like they might even be experiencing dementia or other cognitive disorders, just because their brain is in fight, flight, or freeze mode all the time. And so they're not able to access that frontal lobe that is our logic, our reasoning, and our thought. Therefore, we sometimes worry about their cognition, and they might tell us the story 5 times in a row, but it's just because that's how their brain is in survival mode. And so obviously, we want to watch that for long term, but in the early days, early months of grief, that is a very, very normal thing that I think sometimes we pathologize. Avoidance of people or situations, but also leaning towards a person or situation. So sometimes we want comfort, sometimes we want space. Anger, sadness, loneliness, express feelings of hopelessness, obviously neglect of hygiene, loss of interest in work or activities, anger at self, deceased person, or God, or lost person, I would add in. And I would say that one of the things that I've heard colleagues mention being nervous about is when you hear someone talk about the person that they lost in present tense. And I remember being a little bit nervous about that as well. One second. But Nora from the Hot Young Widows Club described it really beautifully for me. She said that when we're talking about the person in present tense, it's because they feel so present for us. So it's not because someone has these delusions or they think they're going to come back to life. It's because That person is such a real part of them, whether they are, spiritual or whether they just feel them in moments and memories and experiences. And so I think it's really important to distinguish that wouldn't be something you would be super concerned about unless there was some kind of, accompaniment with that, some other kind of symptoms. I think it's also important to talk about with grief that there can be triggering grief. So maybe a person wasn't actively grieving, but then they had a miscarriage history and then they had a baby. They became pregnant again and birthed that baby. So when we fall in love with another child, like we fell in love with a child that we lost, there is an enormity of loss with us because we are experiencing the love that we lost again. It re-triggers that up, it rebubbles that up. It doesn't mean they're doing it wrong. It just means that they loved. And so because they loved, they're experiencing it in a different way. And grief doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens alongside a million other emotions. One of my favorite things that they said about grief is that, when you have a baby, for example, you have this big party, you have these baby showers, the first birthday is such a big deal. And then like birthday 5, we don't say to that person who's experiencing joy to have a 5-year-old, we don't say, stop at the birthday parties. Like, we get it, you had a kid. And we say that to grievers. We say, man, it's 5 years. I can't believe you still light a candle. I can't believe you still need to lock up at home and stay under the covers. Like, we expect them to do this, but we don't have that expectation on joy. And so it really is just understanding that there are a million triggers that could lead someone into starting over that journey or, staying in that journey. One of the things that I think is really helpful to distinguish grief is that when we talk about symptoms of grief, we talk about a broken heart. And one of the words and things that you'll hear is yearning. So when we're looking at, wow, my person is presenting with the same symptoms of depression, but I'm hearing yearning in them, that's when I'm always going to kind of lean towards maybe this is grief. Maybe this isn't something that we need to immediately medicate or regulate. Maybe that this is, grief, because in depression, there's not a core of yearning. So when we're talking about depression, obviously we're talking about symptoms like depressed mood or irritability, loss of interest or pleasure in activities, loss of appetite. Typically we see down with depression. Sometimes we can see, up, but for the most part it's down, that people aren't eating a lot. They're sleeping too much or not enough, obviously. Sluggish movements, fatigue, loss of energy, worthlessness, guilt, some indecisiveness. So again, that brain fog that we just talked about, and impairment in the functioning. And this is also like with grief, we would talk about, well, yeah, impairment in functioning started when you started grieving, but with depression, kind of figuring out that timeline would be helpful. So you just heard me go through the depression symptoms, which sound a lot like the grief symptoms. Exactly. That's the point of this presentation. So, and one of the things that you'll look for as a distinguisher as well with depression is more inward than external. So for a griever, we're going to see, that this is so hard for my family, this is so hard for my children, this is so hard, for the community. Whereas with someone, when we're looking at depression, we're looking at, a more inward focus and more lack of apathy internally. With complicated grief, we're looking at obviously that risk factor like I talked about. Complicated grief is the mixing of previous mental health history on top of grief, or because we're grieving so deeply, we've now entered into possibly some substance use to try to squash the feelings. We've entered into, intense sorrow where we're not able to get that, the car crash out of our mind or the time that she said goodbye out of our mind. And that would be where we would almost be looking a little bit towards like some trauma history with that and looking at how we should treat that and work with that. So the DSM has actually gone back and forth on grief because it's kind of like what I'm saying. They kind of mesh together kind of well. It's hard to differentiate and it's hard to timeline grief. And so the DSM has gone back and forth on diagnoses, across the amount of time. And so you can even see a lot of their debate dialogue and some of their questions on how, we should diagnose and when we should diagnose, and is, should we call this a certain thing or is it just grief? Should we call this bereavement disorder? Should we treat them like we would depression. And so there's even been a lot of, conversations in the mental health community on how to diagnose this. So we're obviously, open. If you guys have attended this webinar and are interested in more treatment, we would be open to offering another webinar. So let us know in the chat box if that's what you want. But what we really want to look at is when we're working with individuals, let me give you kind of a small portion of this. When we're working with individuals, we want to normalize the feelings and experiences when they're grieving. And when we're working with an individual who may have some complicated grief, there's actually been some really cool models designed to help them walk through that. The Center for Complicated Grief with Columbia University has a phenomenal model. I think it's just under $75, and it's an actual treatment guide in helping a griever who may have some other mental health diagnoses and may have, complicated grief. And so they have a really great resource. Obviously, we want to help grieving individuals and individuals who are struggling with depression build a network. We know that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so we want to help them reach out for help. One of the things that's really interesting when I was studying some of the ways that people have grief that turns into complicated grief is a lot of individuals who have to care for their loved ones during their final day. It really can be difficult because they have this exhaustion even before they enter the grief process. And so that's definitely something you want to just keep your eye out when you're working with clients or people that you love. One of the things I think is important to know is that grief can turn into depression. These symptoms can stay. And so just being aware that, if you have someone that you love or a client that you're seeing that doesn't enjoy feeling or was raised with a really dismissive or avoidant attachment style, they're going to have a really hard time leaning into their feelings. And so they're going to need a lot of normalization of that, a lot of awareness of that. Really going to want to watch substances so we're not squashing that down. There's a high percentage of people who grieve who actually, end up with a substance abuse disorder simply because they're just trying to feel it and it gets too much and they're not used to feeling things. And so that's a really important distinction to look at even when we're assessing substance abuse disorders. So I thought it was very interesting. Columbia University shared this. 10 to 15% of individuals who grieve end up experiencing complex grief. And it's really important to understand that anyone who's grieving with a history of a mood or anxiety disorder is going to have a higher likelihood, as well as women are at higher risk than men. And if someone has a trauma history, obviously are much higher. They also look at risk factors being a death or a death being a sudden experience or a loss being a sudden experience, a violent experience, or a very young person dying. So those are going to increase our risk factor for having a hard time processing that loss. So I want to give some time to some resources because I think that's really important. But before I do that, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about this cool concept of sistering. Again, Glennon Doyle taught me this. And basically she talked about a carpenter, forever ago when they were making carpenter terms up, created the fact that if something wasn't strong enough to stand on its own, that you would sister a joint into it. I never can do the L's right. It's always weird. I don't know how to do a double L back to back, but they would sister a joist in to the wood to help it feel supported and stand stronger. And so if you love someone who is grieving, if you love someone who's walking depression, if you love someone who, is grieving and has some high risk factors for this to be difficult, I think one of the really important things that you do is that you just bolt into them. And you bolt into them with support and love and don't judge the experience. And you normalize the experience for them. And if things get concerning, that you walk with them through that. I think it's really important that we, everyone who's on today just acknowledges that our own grief journeys could be triggered even in walking with someone who's grieving. And so as that bolt in, that we have to take care of ourselves because we can't pour from an empty cup. And grief is hard, grief is heavy. You're supporting someone who's grieving. It's a very difficult walk because it's exhausting. And so just normalizing the experience for them and for yourself really can be energizing and helpful and help you feel like you can continue to run that race. So resources. Obviously, if you are a clinician and you're looking at diagnosing, the DSM is really helpful with understanding, diagnostic criteria for depression, major depressive disorder, mixed mood disorders, all of that. Always look at that. My new favorite resource is the Center for Complicated Grief. Like I said, they have an online training. If you're a clinician, they even have, I think it was about 8 downloadable forms that you could use for assessment pieces while working with a client to see how they're progressing, but without asking them questions that may make them feel like pressured into progressing. Megan Devine, this is my favorite. It's Okay That You're Not Okay. Hot Widows Club, great title. She actually has a grief support group online. And the title is, I'm Sorry That the Person You Love Died. It's just a blunt, honest, candid conversation. And then I forgot to say, but Megan Devine, she has a writing group where she teaches people how to write during their grief journeys. And then I love Option B by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant. Sheryl obviously is she was like the CFO or something for Facebook, something super important, and lost her husband tragically. So all 3 of those women that wrote those books tragically lost their partner. So they're not writing from a clinical standpoint, although a lot of them have that history. They're writing from, this is the trenches. And Nora actually has a great TED Talk if you're interested. So I'm going to wrap with a beautiful video. It's going to end us right at 2 o'clock. So stay on if you have questions. And Jenny's going to give us further instructions after the video.
Okay, so Emily, you mentioned that your grief journey did not involve death, which I think is what most people associate grief with. Your grief journey was the loss of a relationship. What are some other things that could trigger grief? Can you grieve things other than people and relationships?
Oh, I have chills. Yes, great question. I have chills all over my body. So, yes, you can grieve all the things. And you don't have to ask me what you can grieve. You can just grieve it. So your experience, isn't defined by what our culture puts it in a box. So I would say you can grieve ideas. You can grieve, the loss of, having a biological child. You can grieve the loss of a best friend that didn't die. You can grieve, a divorce. You can grieve these experiences that you wish that you were having. I mean, right now in the middle of a global pandemic, I'm grieving the fact that, our life looks different. And it's not a direct loss. There's no ceremony to symbolize this, but my life looks different. And that, is the grief experiencing. I'm seeing some of these symptoms are, happening in my own life. So yes, you can grieve what you need to grieve. I want to validate that. Great question.
The other question that we got is, doesn't the hope or promise for a brighter future help us accept the grief and move on better?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. Feeling like you're going to feel better one day does help. Absolutely. Someone telling you this is bad today, it might be better tomorrow, or it might not be. But I think what happens is when we say to people, this is going to get better, and then it keeps not getting better for them, they start feeling like they're feeling grief. And so I think just the permission that it is what it is good. And so it's important. And in the video that I just posted, it talks about, it's like a bunny hopping along with rainbows and sunshine. And it's basically, don't try to fix it for them and promising it's going to get better. The other day I had a friend who was going through a hard thing, and I said, this is terrible. I have seen you fight battles before, and you fight hard. I am here with you as you fight it. And it wasn't you have to win this battle, or this has to look this certain way, but it was, you have strength, you have courage, and let's go into the battlefield together. And so I think it's just being careful how we speak to people, to make sure that they're not integrating it into this expectation of this redemption story.
Perfect. I think you answered this one. So Vanessa, I know you had this question, so if you need more clarification on this, just let us know. But the question was, are there any tools you use to help differentiate between grief, depression, and complex grief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say, listening. If you're a therapist, having an intake sheet that doesn't incorporate presenting symptoms only, that it incorporates, trauma histories, that it incorporates loss histories, and that it doesn't say, have you experienced the death of a loved one, but have you experienced loss? If so, what? So we don't put people in boxes as we're starting the assessment process. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. How does one grieve loss of relationship with a narcissistic mother?
Hell, funny you should ask. So I'm gonna take a deep breath on that one. I think that, I had a really traumatic experience in losing my relationship with my mother. Um, and I'm super open about that. And it really was grieving the loss of all of the plans that I had for us and all the lives that we lived together. And this crazy thing is that I also had to learn to appreciate all the things that I had that were good from her, and that not everything had to be good or bad, that those could be things that live together, that I could honor experiences and that I could grieve experiences, that I could be hurt by her as an adult but still have had a decent childhood. And so I had to kind of figure out and learn that. One of my favorite things to say is that I'm a mother learning to be a mother without a mother. And so honoring what mothering myself looks like with self-care, with allowing myself to grieve, with allowing myself to go under the covers one day if I need to just cry. And so I, instead of trying to figure her out, learned that I had to figure me out, and that the responsibility was not hers, it was mine. And so through that grief journey and through that abandonment by her, I just really had to lean into how to take care of myself and stop feeling responsible for taking care of her. So I would just, give you, the hope that you could learn to lean into yourself, even though it's really scary, and even though it's asking yourself to nurture yourself without your nurturer. And it's really difficult. And I'm sorry going through that.
Yeah. Those are all the questions that I have on the chat. Again, if you guys have additional questions, just make sure that you type those in. We'll give it another minute or so, and if we don't get anything, we will say goodbye.
Yeah, and my email is in the PowerPoint. So if you weren't able to ask a question today, or it maybe felt too vulnerable, please feel free to email me and I would love to connect with you.
There's a lot of praise for you, Emily. Love it. They're loving it.
I just love that we all sat together and had a grief conversation. It's uncomfortable. And I'm grateful that there was a community that showed up for that.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And I think a lot of people are grieving the big things right now, and the little things. And like you talked about, sometimes it's the loss of a relationship, sometimes it's the loss of a routine, with the quarantine going on, everybody is kind of not sure what to do, and they're trying to make a new routine, and there's grief and loss in that as well.
I'm watching my toddler do it right now. He's grieving his friends and his school and his routine, and all the fun things that he did, and the playground down the road he can't go to, and why did dad wear a mask to the grocery store? And so it's a real thing that we as adults are experiencing, but our kids are too.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I think that is it. Like I said, guys, if you liked this presentation, it looks like people were very interested in kind of going a little bit deeper in this. So several people kind of mentioned that. So be on the lookout, and we'll kind of set that up for you maybe in June or so, or July, who knows.
It's a date.
And so, yeah, there you go. So we'll have Emily back to kind of go a little bit deeper in some of the grief and loss and depression and kind of how to treat and kind of do that kind of thing. Again, leave a Google review if you feel so inclined. Stay in touch. Make sure that you're following us on Facebook and all the social media. And we will see you guys next time.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.